Thanks for joining us today. Hello and welcome to Business Daily. I'm Jung in Seoul. Before we get started, let's first get a quick check on today's highlights. The U.S. claims currency manipulating countries have taken hundreds of billions of dollars in trade and production, along with millions of jobs from the U.S. We'll sit down with an expert to talk about this. Valentine's Day may have passed, but 'tis the season of graduation. And this year, it looks like freesias are going to be one of the most popular flower options. But first, Korea's central bank has held its key rate steady at 1.5%, continuing its wait-and-see approach as it faces increasing external risks and a gloomy market at home. Our Hwang Jae tells us more.
Despite mounting pressure to prop up the economy by lowering the key rate, the Bank of Korea kept its rate steady for an 8th straight month in February. While the top central banker did admit that there is room for an additional rate cut, he was skeptical about the effects it could bring.
Adjusting the key rate always brings expectations and side effects with it. But given the current conditions, there are too many external uncertainties that put in question the effect it would have. But the side effects, on the other hand, can sufficiently be predicted.
In fact, amid a global slowdown, Japan's aggressive monetary easing is under fire for not bearing fruit as the government might have hoped, at least for now, instead leading to a stronger yen and a jittery market. Still, Korea's sluggish domestic demand coupled with plummeting exports, the country's traditional growth engine, stand as major sticking points for the central bank.
We've seen the exports plunging in January by 18.5%, the lowest in 6 years. The Bank of Korea still needs to watch these external conditions before they make a rate adjustment.
The unchanged rate of a record low 1.5% this month also comes as the central bank has its hands full with snowballing household debt that stands at a heavy $1 trillion. Given the mixed circumstances, the freeze this month was widely predicted by market analysts, but it remains to be seen how long the central bank will sit on its hands, especially with one of the monetary policymakers arguing for a rate cut in this month's meeting. Hwang Jae, Business Daily.
Diesel prices here in Korea have fallen for 2 straight months amid low global oil prices. According to Korea National Oil Corporation, the average price of diesel at gas stations nationwide on Monday stood at just over 1,100 won a liter, or 91 cents in U.S. currency. This is down 0.621 from the previous day and brings the price of diesel close to the 1,074 won recorded in the first week of July back in 2005. The price of diesel, which reflects changes in global oil prices faster than gasoline, has dropped every day for over 2 months since December 7th. The state-run oil corporation says, however, local diesel prices are unlikely to fall further, with crude oil futures continuing on an upward trend since last week. Just one step away from final approval by U.S. President Barack Obama is a bill related to currency manipulation. Now, the goal here is to weed out countries that tamper with their currencies, and Korea might be on Washington's watch list as well. Our Jung has this report.
In October last year, the U.S. Senate passed a bill that would enforce punitive measures against countries that manipulate their currencies to make exports cheaper and gain unfair trade advantages. Dubbed the BHC Amendment, short for Bennett, Hatch, and Carper, the bill is said to mainly target countries that have large trade surpluses with the U.S., the likes of China and Japan. Also high on the U.S. Treasury Department's list of potential currency manipulators is Korea. A report published by the department cites figures from the IMF indicating the Korean won was undervalued by 5 to 13% in 2014, while its trade surplus with the U.S. stood at $14 billion in the second half of that year, up from the $9.6 billion surplus in the same period a year ago. Experts also say the Korean government appeared to have intervened in the currency market to keep the won from appreciating, a statement that Korean officials deny. They say interventions were only to smooth out extreme won-dollar volatility. Market watchers say this legislation may have greater implications for macroeconomic policies in countries worldwide, and that is highly likely to be signed into law by President Barack Obama in the near future. They add that Korea should take extra measures to strengthen domestic demand and cultivate new markets, as well as increase transparency in foreign exchange interventions. Lee Joo-young, Business Daily.
And to tell us more about this, Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea joins us in the studio today. So good to see you, Professor.
Happy to be here.
All right, so what exactly is this currency manipulation and how is it done?
Okay, well, currency manipulation means that you use policy to change the exchange rates from what markets would naturally lead to in order to give your exports an advantage and increase your trade surplus or current account surplus. So in case of countries other than the U.S., they would use policy to weaken their currencies so that the other countries can export more to the United States and import less.
All right, then what is this Bennett-Hatch-Carper Amendment that the U.S. has drawn up and how did it come about?
Well, the United States had a trade deficit for a long time, since 1975.
Wow.
And they always felt that other countries were taking advantage of the United States because a trade deficit destroys so-called good American jobs in manufacturing. So they've been sort of hounding how to get rid of these deficits for a long time. In the 1980s, it was Japan. In 2000s, it was China. And this time, they're concentrating on foreign exchange rates. They especially feel that China, for a long time, had their currency yuan undervalued, and that created a substantial trade deficit of the United States against China in particular, but in general overall.
Now then, what other countries is the U.S. claiming to be tampering with its currency?
Okay, well, there has been some accusation against Japan. But they also been complaining about Korea as well. Their main target is China, but because Korea and Japan has trade surplus against the United States for a long time, they're also coming into some target.
All right, you talked about Korea, which in fact the U.S. has been accusing Korea for quite a while now for, I guess, manipulating its currency and intervening in the currency market. But then looking at the big picture, it doesn't really seem like that Korea benefited a lot from any obvious or systematic distortion of the exchange rate against the U.S. dollar. So what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, well, Korea is very vulnerable to that type of accusation because, well, since 1998, after the Asian financial crisis, Korea continually had a trade surplus. And if you look at the current account surplus, we, as a percentage of GDP, we actually have a higher current account surplus than even China. And we've been maintaining very high levels of foreign exchange rate reserves. So though there's some question on whether it's sufficient, but well, when the government builds up the current foreign exchange rate reserves, that means they go into the market and buy U.S. dollars, which strengthens the U.S. dollar and weakens the Korean won. So the method that Korea has gone on to build up the reserves makes Korea especially vulnerable.
But then hearing that, then shouldn't the U.S. take a closer look at countries that belong to the so-called negative rates club, like some of the countries in Europe and Japan as well, when it comes to tampering with its currency?
Well, if you look at the amendment as currently written and passed Congress, it just says that they will look at the exchange rates. So they don't exactly define what they think a low manipulated rate is. Now, if you look at some of the observers who have argued for this type of legislation, they want to exempt any changes in exchange rates coming from monetary policy.
Okay.
Now, so if you look at euro and if you look at Japanese yen, the reason that they weaken so much is as part of their monetary policy to reduce interest rates and increase the vitality of the domestic economy. So at least according to the supporters of the amendment, that's exempted from this amendment.
All right, along with those supporters are also criticisms against the U.S. or towards the U.S. With the country's ballooning deficits, with its trading partner, and this latest amendment are going to bring other countries down with it. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, well, problem is nobody's quite sure exactly why the U.S. trade deficit has gone on for so long. Now, obviously, the members of U.S. Congress think that it's because of currency manipulation and foreign trade barriers. On the other hand, a lot of macroeconomists think that it is because the U.S. has been maintaining a government budget deficit for a long time, so they need to borrow money from abroad. The American savings rate is much too low, so they find fault with American macroeconomics, and they think that unless the American macroeconomics get into shape, they will continually have trade deficits. So you have the same set of numbers, but it can be interpreted different ways, and obviously the U.S. Congress has settled on an interpretation which works best for them.
Right. Then what should the Korean government do in order to prepare for a possible dispute with the U.S. at the same time avoid wild currency fluctuations?
Okay, well, as the amendment has set up the procedure right now, it's similar to what Korea used to be afraid of 20 years ago, the so-called 301 process.
Okay.
That means that every year or every half year, the USTR is supposed to look at the state of real effective exchange rates for different U.S. trading partners, and then assign a report to the Congress. And based on the report from the Congress, the president must take appropriate actions, which include negotiations. But it's not clear right now whether the type of negotiations that U.S. president will do will be consistent with WTO procedures, because WTO right now doesn't allow for any retaliation based on currency rates. Okay. IMF does have a provision for that, but IMF has never really enforced it, and IMF doesn't have any procedures to say what happens if a country uses manipulated exchange rates. So it's sort of a blank slate right now.
All right.
And depending on how the U.S. goes about it, it may be WTO inconsistent. So we'll have to see how the U.S. does it. From this side of Korea, one thing that it can do is try, if the U.S. comes very strongly against this type of what they think is currency manipulation, then Korea may attempt to try to introduce some capital control, especially for short-term flow of capital, because, well, one of the reasons why the Korean exchange rate fluctuates so much and sometimes gets misaligned is because of short-term capital flows coming in and out of the country.
Right.
Also, if the U.S. is so worried about the currency manipulation, then one thing that the U.S. can do is sign more currency swaps with countries which are vulnerable to financial crisis, so that they don't need to build up so much reserves against the possible foreign exchange rate crisis.
All right, so a lot of things that the U.S. and Korea can do ahead of this amendment. All right, thank you so much for coming in today, Professor.
Thank you.
Hyundai Motors' market share in Brazil hit an all-time monthly high in January, despite the country's slowing economy. According to data by a Brazilian dealership association, the Korean automaker sold slightly over 14,800 cars in Brazil last month, accounting for 9.9% of total monthly sales. This latest figure marks a new record for Hyundai Motor, whose previous market share record was 9.1% set in October. In terms of sales, Hyundai saw performance drop nearly 16% on year, but its share in the Brazilian market was driven up by a sharp decline in overall car sales, which plunged nearly 40% in the same period. Last month, Hyundai Motors sold almost 9,000 units of the Ep.226 hatchback, the second best-selling model in the country, following the GM Onix. This week marks the start of graduation season here in Korea, and along with it, the flower market is warming up. Our Eunice Kim takes us to a local flower market where among the first being prepped to be shipped out are freesias.
Surviving the winter chill, a flower bud pops open, revealing a bright yellow hue. Freesias are popular during graduation and back-to-school seasons, as the bell-shaped blooms symbolize innocence and purity. The farms are bustling with activity.
We planted at the start of September and they're just now beginning to flower. I hope for speedy growth and good sales.
Freesia has a reputation of being a dutiful blossom for its ability to withstand cold temperatures. Still, farmers are about a week behind their typical shipment schedule due to the little sunshine and cold snap that pinched temperatures. Freesia production will extend through the end of March, and some of those flowers will head to Japan.
If we can begin distribution in time for Japan's graduation season at the end of February, we believe it'll help the farm's bottom line.
At the flower market, freesia of various bright colors and figures tempt customers passing by. There was some worry as flower prices had noticeably risen, but the market's alive again in time for one of its busiest seasons.
We are seeing more customers, so we are stocking up to make sure we don't run out.
Capitalizing on a busy season, the so-called messenger of spring is injecting some warmth into the flower market and farms. Eunice Kim, Business Daily.
And that does it for today, but we'll be back tomorrow with more, so don't forget to tune in then. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye for now.